Hi, everybody. So this week we're looking at Chapter 2, Understanding Human Sexuality, Theory and Research. So we'll look at what are the different theories related to sexuality or the different models that are present. We'll look at some of the more famous and prominent sex researchers, some research methods and problems and issues with conducting research related to human sexuality. And just as a quick side note, I have this image here of a researcher with the birds and the bees next to her, a very common expression that we often use as a metaphor to teach children about sex. But the idea here is that bees carry and deposit pollen into flowers, a visible and easy to explain example of male fertilization, and birds lay eggs, a similar and visible, easy to explain explanation of female ovulation. Not perfect, but that's where that birds and the bees metaphor comes from. If you've ever heard that phrase, we're going to talk about the birds and the bees. In this case, we are going to research that idea. So just as a little side note for you to start with. But one of the big things covered in Chapter 2 in the textbook has to do with different theories of sexuality. Now, psychology has a lot of theories or models or lenses, paradigms. They're all kind of synonymous phrases for a theory, a set of assumptions, principles, or methods that helps a researcher to understand the nature of a phenomenon being studied. Theories or models provide an intellectual structure for a way to view something. And in this case, we're talking about sexuality. So a structure for how we can view what has shaped your sexuality. What are the different theories or ideas or forces that have maybe shaped you into the person that you are today in terms of a sexual being? Now, these theories can often clash and overlap. There are an incredible number of them, and they're talked about really nicely in your book. So I'm not going to go into detail on them, but there are a lot of different theories of sexuality. Freud, in his ideas of psychoanalysis, talked a lot about how unconscious and early childhood experiences can set the stage for your expectations and ideas about relationships. Behavioral perspectives on sexuality look at how have we learned certain things? How have we been conditioned into certain preferences? Do we have fetishes that we've learned through conditioning? What are our relationship patterns and what are the things that we've been conditioned and learned to experience? Social learning perspectives look at internal and external factors. They look at biology plus experiences. How are they combining together to shape our sexuality? Cognitive theories look a lot at our thoughts. What are the different expectations and stereotypes and thinking patterns that we might have related to sex? The humanistic theories look a lot at like relationships as a way to realize your potential. What are you expecting and valuing within a relationship? The evolutionary theories look at trends in behavior, mate selection, survival of the fittest, looking at reproduction as a way to perpetuate and continue the species. Biological perspectives look at hormones, biology, physiology, and how our hormones and genes might influence how we fall in love and the feelings of love that we have, and our sex and gender identities. Sociological and feminist ideas around sexuality. Sociological look at social influences, our images and concepts related to sex. How do we define sexy? How do we define relationship, right? What does it mean to go on a date, right? So looking at some of those kind of social constructs. Feminist theory looks at power and social constructions and dynamics related to power in different categories. And then queer theory looks a lot at how do we define people in terms of their sexuality and put them into various categories such as gay, straight, bisexual, asexual, pansexual, and so on. So all of these different theories are going to discuss what are the different factors that might be shaping how your sexuality develops, your notions and ideas and feelings around sex. They're going to be developed and shaped by a lot of different factors. And that's what these theories are trying to capture. When it comes to research related to sex, we call a professional who studies sexuality a sexologist, right? And there are a lot of people who study sex and perform sexuality research, but it's still something that we need a lot more to be done here. There's a lot that we don't know and don't understand. If you go back in time in the 19th century, when this research started to become popular, it focused more on the bizarre, dangerous, and unhealthy aspects of sex. And it was largely conducted by physicians and very problem-driven and fragmented and heavily influenced by the politics and events of the time. Oftentimes, people who were sex researchers found themselves shunned or shamed in their academic and professional communities. They found themselves without a job, right? People who performed research in sex were viewed as perverts and viewed in a very negative light. And that isn't so much the case anymore, though there's still a lot of stigma around performing and conducting research related to sexuality. There are an incredible number of researchers who played a prominent role in the advances in knowledge that we have in the field. I just have a few of them listed here, and the ones on this page are smaller contributors, but they're still people that are worth mentioning. Sigmund Freud had a lot of very controversial theories about childhood sexuality and things that he called the libido and sexual energy that manifests itself in different parts of the body as we age. Very controversial, but he's one of the very prominent and early researchers in the field of psychology. And a lot of his ideas and theories were very much shaped around sex and aggressive urges. Ewan Block played a big role in one of the first journals of sexology. He published the Journal of Sexology, and it was a very controversial, very scandalous development at the time. Magnus Hirschfeld founded the first institute for sexology where people could go for advice and help. Richard von Krafft-Ebing wrote one of the most kind of medically based books related to sexuality, Psychopathia Sexualis. This is the original cover right here. Looks like it'd be incredibly interesting, but it's actually very medical and a little bit dry to read, but one of the first books to talk about kind of variants and changes and different presentations of sexuality. Havelock Ellis wrote the Studies in the Psychology of Sex. And then Clelia Mosher, another one of the kind of early researchers studying ideas of sexuality. There's a lot of these people who were pioneers in the field, and again, were met with a lot of resistance, right? They had a very hard time professionally or academically establishing credibility because it was viewed as a negative thing to study sexuality. The three people or groups of people on this slide are some of the more prominent and bigger names in sex research, starting with Alfred Kinsey. And you're going to be watching part of a documentary on Kinsey this week. There's another video that's posted on Canvas that I'm asking you to watch. Also, like the documentary from last week, fascinating to see the different attitudes from, almost 100 years ago, or like 50 years ago, I guess at this point, 50 to 70 years ago. I'll get the right number here. But he was one of the most influential sex researchers of the 20th century, conducted an incredible amount of research, a biologist and professor who interviewed the first kind of large scale research project related to human sexuality. A lot of psychometric statistical issues with his research, but it was still one of the most prominent studies and led to some very prominent books that were published in the 20th century. Masters and Johnson, William Masters and Virginia Johnson, spent a lot of time observing the act of sex between heterosexual partners. Now, in the 1950s, Masters and Johnson were conducting their research, asking for volunteers, hooking them up to various instruments to measure how their body responded during intercourse. They measured penile erection, vaginal lubrication. They found out a lot about how our bodies tend to respond in the sexual response cycles that we go through, the differences between men and women in the way that their bodies do respond to sex. A lot of very important information. And again, we're met with a lot of resistance at the time. Evelyn Hooker probably has the best name you could hope for a sex researcher, right? Or maybe the worst name, depending on your perspective. Was really well known for her research in the 60s and 70s, which led to removing homosexuality from the DSM and viewing it as a mental illness. She compared gay men and straight men when it came to sexuality, and her research was very influential in changing the perspective on viewing homosexuality as a mental illness, which it was all the way up until 1973. There was an interesting documentary not that long ago made called The Masters of Sex, related to Masters and Johnson, just to give that a little plug if you were interested in watching that and learning more. Lots of problems and issues related to sex research. And normally in person, when I'm teaching this class in person, we go out into the campus and we perform a little bit of sex research, and it's really interesting and we talk a lot about it. Sadly, we don't get to do that this semester, but you will get to think about what you would want to study in our discussion for this week. But there are a lot of ethical and sampling related problems in any kind of research, but specifically here in sex research. Some of the ethical issues: confidentiality. Anything that you obtain from a participant needs to be kept private. You can make generalizations, but you can't reveal, like, this person here has had sex this many times, so you have to keep it very general and confidential. Informed consent. You have to let people know what they're getting themselves into. You have to get their consent or agreement to performing research or participating in research. And both of these things can be obstacles in any kind of research, but definitely in sex research nonetheless. You also get some sampling problems. Things like a volunteer bias can be a struggle that people have, where you can't get people to participate other than ones that have volunteered. Right, so Masters and Johnson ran into a lot of issues with this. Imagine that you have been asked to volunteer in sex research, where we are going to record you having sex with your partner. And we're going to hook up instruments to your body to measure what your body is going through and how it's reacting. A lot of people don't want to participate in that kind of research. And so is there something unique or different about people who might volunteer to do that? Is there a slanting or a bias of the research that takes place when you only get volunteers? And so that's something that we have to address in this type of research as well, along with validity and reliability concerns, right? When somebody is telling you stuff about their sexual history or about their orientation, is it accurate? Is it consistent? Does it matter how I ask you, or if I ask you alone versus in a group, right? And people oftentimes are uncomfortable talking about sex. And so you can get a slanting or bias of some of the research, depending on how these questions are asked and in what format and in what venue. So your discussion for this week, you're going to be, so this, again, that would be something you would do in person, which we're not doing this time around. But for your discussion this week, you're going to be talking about, if you were to conduct any kind of sex research, what would you want to know? And how would you go about answering those questions? You're going to want to make sure that you've read chapter 2 in the textbook, which goes a little more into the depths and detail about different methods of conducting research. But that concludes kind of a short chapter 2 related to researching sexuality. Make sure that you watch the Kinsey documentary I have posted for you. I kept this a little brief since I'm asking you to watch that video, and get going on all the other required weekly materials. I'll see you all next week for our next chapter.